The initial attack was facilitated therefore by the barrenness of this neighborhood. At the time she was assaulted, 75% of the units in her building were empty. Former residents had been forced to move to faraway neighborhoods, but were also in and out of the complex. And so there was a sort of arbitrary and chaotic nature of this human dispersion, if you will. The people who were there most consistently, black women and their children, didn't know which apartments were occupied and which were vacant. They were left to fend for themselves in an increasingly desolate neighborhood. And daily activities, trips to the grocery store, visits with family and friends, going to work, became fraught with risk. And the risk that comes from sort of an abandoned neighborhood with no one there except a hostile police force. The undercover cops, on one of their attacks, pushed her into her apartment, went down the hall to the bedroom that her son and a friend were in, a 19-year-old were in, destroyed almost all of her property on their way in her small apartment to the bedroom, took turns for 30 minutes, punching and kicking the young men until they handcuffed them and removed them from the apartment. In response to Ms. B's plea for mercy for her son, 2 police officers who remained in the apartment led her to a bathroom, ordered her to remove all of her clothes, to lie down on the floor, to spread her legs, and to effectively do an internal cavity search on herself while they stood over her and watched. The police officers worked for a special unit of Chicago Police Department, but they never identified themselves as such. They never produced a warrant. They didn't explain the reason for the so-called search. They never read her constitutional rights. And they left as abruptly as they came, leaving a reign of humiliation and degradation and violence in their wake. This same group of rogue police officers, all white men, all young, assaulted Ms. B over and over again for a number of months. Physical battering, sexual assault, stalking, destroying her personal property, threatening members of her family, some of whom were particularly vulnerable because they were on parole or probation. They often had their weapons drawn. They put drugs on her and threatened her with false arrests, and often required her to perform sexual acts in order to avoid arrest. Ms. B called these experiences dry rapes, and regrettably for Ms. B, that was a very familiar analogy to make because she had been gang raped twice by acquaintances in this desolate environment, a neighborhood in transition. It became an ideal backdrop. Community members were resentful of their displacement. They misdirected that anger toward vulnerable women like Ms. B. There was a presence of aggressive demolition crews, other city workers in and out of her space. She learned that it was useless to rely on public state authorities for protection. She attempted to get help twice from rape crisis centers. On no fewer than 3 occasions, she filed complaints with both Chicago Housing Authority and the Chicago Police Department's Office of Professional Standards, to no avail. Eventually, she began staying home in her own community, which often led to more isolation and risk for her, especially to the undercover cops. It was never clear why she in particular was targeted, but it's possible that because she was for a number of years an activist in the community group that was resisting the plan for transformation, that she was, and she was one of the last to move, that she was targeted because of her activism. I want to go quickly to another city and another story to talk about a summer evening where 4 young black lesbians were walking through Greenwich Village in New York City. And most of you know Greenwich Village is a part of New York with a liberal reputation earned through activism and resistance by members of the black, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered community in the 1960s. And so these 4 black lesbians felt like they were in a place where the public acceptance of sexuality was something that they were going to participate in. Although as they walked by a young man selling DVDs from a card table, he sexually propositioned them in insulting ways, including, well, I won't use the words, you can imagine what they were, while he grabbed his genitals. Angry and embarrassed, they tried to get away from him. They crossed the street. A security camera was following all of this. It's on record. He continued harassing them until they finally turned around and confronted him, which led to a heated argument. One of the young women was on the floor, burned by a cigarette. Another one had her hair pulled out. Significant physical fight ensued, and most of the eyewitnesses have verified that the young women were protecting themselves. Still, they were arrested, all four of them. All four of them were charged with various crimes, attempted manslaughter, etc. All four of them served time in prison. One still is in prison. And they've come to be known as the New Jersey Four. I mentioned their case and ask you to look online, learn more about it, and become involved in the resistance movement for her freedom in particular. But I want to say one quick thing about that assault. So that was a violent sexual assault against 4 Black queer women. What's important is not only the assault, but in fact the ways that the mainstream media didn't pick up the case, that anti-violence programs didn't show up at the trial, that even those high-profile, well-organized Black community organizing groups that often are present in cases of brutality were absent in their trial. So it was not only the abuse that they experienced, but the ways that the communities denied it. There are other stories in the book. Sarah Crusan serving a life sentence for killing her abusive pimp, the disappearance of 12 Black women in Cleveland, Ohio, that were never picked up by the mainstream press, but also who the police took years and years to find because, in fact, they were prostitutes. The story of Mildred Muhammad, who's the wife of John Muhammad. Some of you may recognize that name, the DC sniper. He was actually trying to kill her and killed all of those other people as a way to cover for his domestic homicide. There are hundreds of other stories like these. Some of them are told in Arrested Justice. Really, it's a story about how the evolution of the anti-violence movement and its professionalized feminism can't accommodate questions of race and class because of our relationship to the criminal legal system. But it's also a story about the movement against the carceral state. The movement for penal abolition hasn't attended to questions of gender and sexuality. That's the Arrested Justice that I write about. I write about it in part because I cared about those stories. And we're here tonight to talk about it because I not only wrote about it, but I think more importantly, there's a panel of people who have taken up this issue. It's, as I said, a space I've been waiting to be in for 30 years or more. And I feel like when the panel comes up, and I think they're about to soon, when the panel comes up, you, like me, will realize that as devastating as the stories are, and as much as our resistance movements have failed these women, we're in good hands now because of the kind of work that we'll hear about tonight. So I appreciate you coming to hear from them, but more I appreciate when you leave here that we'll organize in some different way so that the story would have ended very differently. Thank you so much.